They say time buries everything, but some things refuse to stay buried. I found this story by accident inside a warped chest sold at an estate auction in Southern Virginia. Inside were 37 letters, a faded family Bible, and a lock of hair, tied with a black ribbon that hadn't rotted in over a century. The name written on the first page was Lou Crane, dated 1791. That was the beginning of a family that shouldn't have existed, at least not like this. The Cranes lived in a place called Hollow's Bend, gone now, erased from every county map since the 1940s. But back then, it was a small settlement tucked in a valley where the soil stayed strangely warm through winter. Neighbors used to say crops grew faster there, animals were born larger, and that the Cranes aged slower than most. At first, it seemed like a blessing. Their patriarch, Elihu, lived past 90, unheard of at the time, still walking upright when most men were long buried. His children thrived, his grandchildren too. But there were whispers that none of the Crane women ever married outside the bloodline. Not once. In over 100 years, the family's faces stayed eerily similar in every surviving photograph. The same pale eyes, the same angular jaw. It was as if the blood refused to dilute. When the Civil War came, the Cranes were untouched. Their land never burned, their men never drafted. People said they'd made some kind of pact, not with soldiers, but with something older. Travelers who passed through Hollow's Bend said they'd seen strange lights moving through the fields at night, and a sound that wasn't quite human, humming under the earth like the valley itself was alive. After the war, Hollow's Bend began to empty. One by one, families left. By 1912, only the Cranes remained, and that's where the letters start to change. The handwriting becomes nervous, uneven. Elihu's descendants begin to describe things, sightings, dreams, and the sense that something beneath their land was moving, growing, watching. They'd inherited something they didn't understand, and whatever it was, it wasn't done with them yet. By 1918, the Crane family had become reclusive to the point of obsession. The youngest son, Isaac Crane, kept meticulous journals, recording what he called the family pattern. He noticed something no outsider could have. Every firstborn child of each generation was born on the same day, October 14th, no matter how many decades passed. Sometimes the mothers went into labor early, sometimes weeks late, but always the 14th. Isaac wrote that the midwives would grow pale when it happened, as if they knew something they couldn't say out loud. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. His journals describe a ritual, though he never names it directly. Every 10th October, the family would gather beneath the oak tree at the edge of their land, the one that never lost its leaves even in frost. They would dig a shallow hole, place a small wooden box inside, and cover it before dawn. Inside that box, according to Isaac, was a fragment of what keeps us whole. He doesn't explain what that means, only that if the ritual was skipped, someone in the family would begin to come apart. In 1927, the first real tragedy struck. Martha Crane, Isaac's sister, vanished from her room in the middle of the night. No forced entry, no footprints, just an open window and a strange residue on the sill, like ash, but damp to the touch. Her nightgown was later found buried in the field, folded neatly inside another wooden box. On the lid, carved into the grain, were the words, "Too late." After that, the letters grow fewer. The handwriting changes hands, as if passed from one survivor to another. Each letter references the hum, a low vibration that shook the walls every night at the same hour. It was said to come from beneath the soil, from the place where the Cranes had built their house generations before. Some said it was the earth shifting. Others whispered that it was the sound of the buried, something older than the family, and something they'd promised never to disturb. By the time the Great Depression hit, the Cranes were nearly forgotten. No census listed them, no mail reached them. Only a few wanderers mentioned their land, a house still standing, lights glowing at night, though no one was ever seen inside. It was around this time that the final generation began to change. By 1933, the last of the Cranes were 4 in number: Isaac, his wife Lillian, and their twin sons Thomas and Eerie. They lived almost entirely off the grid, refusing all contact with the town. The few who claimed to see them described pale figures in old-fashioned clothes walking the fields at dusk, speaking to no one. One mail carrier said he saw Isaac digging near the oak tree during a thunderstorm, lightning flashing around him while he muttered words that weren't quite English. When the carrier returned the next day, the soil was perfectly flat again, no sign of disturbance. But the oak tree had moved. Lillian's letters from that year are the most disturbing of all. Her handwriting becomes frantic looping, smeared with what looks like tears. She speaks of the boys, how they'd begun hearing the hum louder than anyone else, how they would wake at the same time each night and walk barefoot into the fields, eyes open but unseeing. They're being called, she wrote. Our blood is answering. She begged Isaac to leave the land, but he refused. He said the cranes were bound to Hollow's Bend, till the debt is fulfilled. And then the night of October 14th came again. Lillian wrote that the twins both disappeared before dawn. She searched for hours before finding them at the base of the oak tree, kneeling side by side, their hands buried in the soil as if reaching for something beneath. She pulled them away, but the ground was warm, pulsing, like it was breathing. She said she felt it move against her palms. After that night, the humming stopped completely. The air went still. The valley felt empty for the first time in generations. 3 days later, a traveling preacher came upon the Crane farmhouse. The front door was open. The table was set for 4, plates untouched. No sign of struggle, no blood, no bodies. Only a faint residue on the floorboards, the same gray ash described in Martha's disappearance decades earlier. The oak tree was gone, not cut down, not uprooted, gone, as if it had never been there at all. No one lived in Hollow's Bend again. The land was eventually sold, renamed, divided into farmland. But beneath it, Isaac's journals were found, sealed in a tin box. The last page was dated October 15, 1933. It read, "The debt is collected, the bloodline is closed," or so they thought in 1954. Construction crews breaking ground for a new highway unearthed what they thought was an animal burial pit near the old Crane property line. But when they opened it, they found bones, small, delicate, arranged in pairs. Each pair had been carefully placed facing east, palms upward, as if waiting for something to return. The state archaeologists labeled it a pre-colonial site and sealed it off. The workers refused to go back after 2 of them suffered identical injuries on the same day. Deep cuts across the hands, as though they'd been holding something that fought to get free. Local rumor began to stir again. Old men in nearby towns remembered their fathers talking about the Cranes, how their faces never changed, how the air around their house had a weight to it. The youngest workers started a game. Drive out to the valley at night and see if you could hear the hum. They said if you stood still long enough, you'd feel it under your shoes, faint but steady. Most laughed it off, but some didn't come back. By 1962, a portion of the land was quietly purchased by a private research group. No name, no university affiliation. Locals saw floodlights go up, tents, strange equipment humming day and night. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The crew disappeared. The site was abandoned again, fences torn down by weather and time. The state claimed it had been environmental testing, but no one could explain why the grass near the dig site still refuses to grow even now. A few photographs from that period survive, filed anonymously to the county archives. In one, there's a man standing beside the trench. His face is hard to make out, blurred by motion, but the resemblance to an earlier Crane portrait is unmistakable. The same pale eyes, the same jawline. The photo is dated 1962, but the man in the image looks exactly like Isaac Crane, who had supposedly died 30 years earlier. If the bloodline truly ended, something forgot to tell the blood. They say Hollow's Bend was eventually flooded to make way for a reservoir, an easy way to hide whatever was left beneath. But fishermen who cast their lines there still talk about the nights when the water seems to move on its own, rippling though there's no wind, humming softly like a buried memory trying to rise. By the 1970s, Hollow's Bend existed only in stories, a place mentioned in whispers by hunters and travelers, its location never marked, its name fading from the county's records. But in 1978, something surfaced that reignited the legend. A man named Harold Pritchard bought a farmhouse just a few miles from the reservoir's edge. He was a retired engineer, practical, level-headed. Within a month, he began writing to local authorities, not about ghosts, but about vibrations. He claimed that every night, at precisely 3:14 a.m., the house would tremble slightly. Tools on his workbench would rattle, and the soil outside would quiver like breath beneath the surface. The county sent inspectors. They found nothing. No gas lines, no geological activity, no fault lines. But Harold's letters continued. He started referring to voices carried through the vibration, whispers that weren't quite words, yet somehow intelligible. He said they spoke of unfinished lineage and blood without rest. Then the letters stopped. Months later, his son came to check on him. The house was empty. The clocks had stopped at 30:14. On the table sat an open notebook filled with unfamiliar handwriting, flowing, elegant, not Harold's. The final line read, "We returned by pattern, not by name. Police ruled it a disappearance." But a photo from the investigation shows something small and unsettling, a framed portrait above the mantel. It's a family photo, 4 figures, 2 adults and 2 children. But their faces are faded almost to nothing, except for the faint outline of eyes, pale gray, staring. After that, the story spread again. Fishermen, hikers, late-night wanderers began to speak of shapes seen near the reservoir's edge. Not apparitions, not quite human, but too familiar to ignore. Faces glimpsed for seconds, vanishing into the dark. A hum beneath the surface that grew louder when storms rolled in. By 1985, the county sealed off the area entirely, citing unsafe terrain. But the locals knew better. They called it the Crane Ground, a place that resisted being buried. And for a while, silence returned. No sightings, no hums, no disappearances. Until 1991, exactly 200 years after the first name appeared in that Bible I found. And that's when the letters began again. They arrived anonymously in plain envelopes without return addresses, all postmarked from small towns across the eastern seaboard. Some were written in ink, others in pencil, one typed on a machine decades out of date. But they all began the same way. What remains of the pattern? The handwriting was eerily familiar. I compared it to Isaac Crane's journals. The same precise loops, the same deliberate spacing. But that would be impossible. These letters were dated between 1991 and 2007. Whoever wrote them seemed to know everything, details no one could have known outside the family. They spoke of the hum as the signal, of the oak tree as the first root, and of Hollow's Bend as the wound that never closed. In one, the author described being drawn to places of unnatural warmth, basements where the air vibrated faintly, abandoned lots where the soil pulsed underfoot. They said the hum was waking again, and that those of the line could feel it in their bones. "We are scattered now," one letter read, "but the pattern calls us to gather." Then the content shifted from memory to prophecy. The letters predicted floods, blackouts, even exact dates when the ground will breathe again. A few of those dates matched real events: minor earthquakes, sinkholes, strange power outages across Virginia and the Carolinas. Coincidence maybe, but one detail stood out. Each of those locations lay directly along the old river that once fed Hollow's Bend. The last letter arrived in 2007. It was the only one sent directly to a museum, the Historical Society of Richmond. Inside was a single photograph. The image showed a group of 12 people standing in front of the drained reservoir, hands joined. Their faces were blurred, as if the film had melted. Behind them, in the exposed mud, stood something impossible: the outline of a tree, perfectly formed, stretching 20 feet high, though made entirely of soil, its roots coiled outward like veins. Beneath the photo, a note was written in careful, trembling script: "The pattern endures. We have defied death, and death will now return the favor. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most." Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run or answered the call? When I first started investigating the Crane family, I thought I was chasing a myth, a ghost story stitched together from folklore and bad dreams. But the deeper I dug, the more I began to understand that what happened in Hollow's Bend wasn't superstition. It was continuation, something that learned to persist not through the body, but through memory, through the act of telling. In 2019, I visited the reservoir site, or what's left of it. The area is overgrown now, trees warped and leaning inward, as though the forest itself were circling a wound. The waterline has receded in strange, symmetrical patterns, almost like rings on a tree trunk, and there's still that faint vibration in the air, barely perceptible until you stand still long enough to let it find you. It doesn't come from the ground anymore. It comes from underneath the water. pulsing, slow alive. Near the bank, I found a stone marker half buried in mud. On its surface, the letters were worn down by decades of decay, but I could still read the carving EC 1791, the first crane, and below it a second inscription, faint but unmistakable, "The soil remembers." That night, I stayed in my car nearby, unable to sleep. Around 3 a.m., the hum began again, louder this time. The rearview mirror shook. The air turned heavy. For a moment, it felt like something beneath the reservoir had risen to the surface and was looking back. And then I saw it. Or thought I did. A single light in the distance, floating just above the water. It moved slowly, deliberately toward the center, until it disappeared beneath the reflection of the moon. The next morning I went back. There were footprints leading into the shallows, bare, adult-sized, and fresh. No footprints leading out. So maybe the cranes never died out. Maybe their blood found a way to survive, not in bodies, but in the places they refused to leave behind. Maybe that's what the pattern truly is. A call to return to the soil, to become part of the hum itself. If you ever drive through southern Virginia and feel the ground tremble beneath your feet, don't linger, don't listen. Because once you hear it clearly, it's already too late. The land has recognized you, and now you belong to it.